Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our National Farm Health and Safety Week webinar series. Today we're talking about confined space, ensuring safety and compliance. So compliance and safety kind of go hand in hand. So we really appreciate you joining us today. My name is Natalie Gupton, and I'm the Director of Business Services and Industry Relations. I'm located in Louisville, Kentucky. Of course, if you're familiar with AgSafe, we are based in Modesto, California, and we specialize in agriculture, safety, and health. You may find more information about us and some upcoming classes and seminars at agsafe.org. And of course, you can follow us on social media at AgSafe Online. So again, thank you for joining us today. Before we get into the meat of today's presentation, take a moment to read our quick disclaimer on your own, and then we'll get started. Okay, so today's objectives, we're going to talk about the definition of a confined space, understand what exactly is a permit required confined space. We're talking about some incident prevention, written program requirements, and I see I have a repeat of written program and then written permit requirements, and then some grain safety as well as manure pit. So what is a confined space? So many workers or workplaces contain spaces that are considered to be confined because their configurations hinder the activities of employees who must enter into, work in, or exit from them. So in many instances, employees who work in confined spaces are also faced with increased risk of exposure to serious injury from hazards such as entrapment, engulfment, and hazardous atmospheric conditions. So confinement itself may pose entrapment hazards, and working confined spaces may keep employees closer to hazards such as machinery components than they would be otherwise. So for example, confinement is limited access and restricted airflow can result in hazardous conditions that would not normally arise in an open workplace. So looking at the definition on the screen, that a confined space is defined as spaces that are defined for people, but they are not designed for people, but they are large enough for workers to enter and to perform certain jobs. And so two things, it has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous occupancy. So some examples here, we're talking about tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, hoppers, vaults, pits, manholes, equipment housing, ductwork, and pipelines are some of the common places that we see on the farm. So let's talk a little bit about those permit required confined spaces. So OSHA used the term permit required confined space to describe a confined space that has one or more of the following characteristics. It has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, contains material that has the potential for engulfment or entrapment, has walls that converge inward or floors that slope downward and taper into a smaller area, which could trap or asphyxiate an entrant. Or it contains any other recognized safety or health hazards such as an unguarded machinery, exposed live wires, or heat stress. So I get into these definitions because OSHA has some of these things in place, and though the OSHA confined space regulation doesn't apply directly to agriculture, it's used as a guide for safety measures in the workplace. Regardless of whether you need to be OSHA compliant or not, these are some great things to pay attention to when thinking about spaces, confined spaces on the farm. Whether you need a permit or not, thinking about what creates these hazards and what can you do to help alleviate some of the hazards that come with those confined spaces. So let's really get into incident prevention. Identify and label all confined spaces. So again, we talked earlier about some examples that we see on the farm and what makes up a confined space. But take a look at this list and think about your facilities, your farm, your operation. What do you have that would fall into one of these confined spaces or would be defined as a confined space? Do you have it properly labeled and identified? Do you have folks that work around it on a regular basis? Do you work on it on a regular basis to really know and understand the hazards that come with these and what comes with a confined space? So let's talk about incident prevention. So first, let's talk, one, identify and label all confined spaces. So we just talked about that and thinking about those examples that were on the previous screen. Number two, evaluate all confined spaces to determine if they contain any actual or potential hazards. Number three, train workers to never enter a confined space before the hazards and the steps to address the hazards to provide for safe entry and exit has been identified. Number four, ensure workers review, understand, and follow procedures before entering confined spaces and know how and when to exit. So ensure there's a safe means to enter and to exit the space, such as using ladders. And number five, consider chemical reactions that could occur based on the materials that would be located in that confined space and the potential byproducts that could create a hazardous atmosphere. So working on ensuring air sampling is conducted prior to anyone entering that space. Ensure that the sampling equipment is the right type of equipment used to measure what you're looking for. So make sure it's appropriate for the needs that you have. Use an appropriate routine and simple detection approach. So a four gas meter will only detect oxygen deficiency and 3 additional hazards, usually flammability, your carbon monoxide, and your hydrogen sulfide. So detector tubes are a simple handheld meter such as a photonization detector may also be needed. So going back to evaluating your confined spaces and realizing what hazards could be potentially available, knowing what type of meters that you need to measure those chemical or hazardous levels that could be present in that space. So, doing that analysis and ensuring that those aren't present before you enter that space. So being very proactive, if you ever need to enter these spaces, that you know that you have the right tools available to you to ensure that it's safe. Number 6 is use a written confined space entry system. And so we're going to talk about a written plan here in just a second. And then number 7, develop an emergency action plan. Apologize for that typo there. So have an action plan in place to know, that includes a quick removal of the entrant and the procedures for facility operators and local responders. Communicate the plan to workers and ensure that is reviewed and updated regularly. So not only do you need an emergency action plan for your farm in general, but to have one specifically for confined spaces. I know my state in Kentucky, we do a great job of working with our first responders and ensuring that they are trained and understand the dangers, specifically with grain engulfment, what to do, having the proper tools available and in place. So not only having yourselves trained, but actually working with your emergency responders and helping them understand the unique conditions that you have on your farm and on your operation. So permit required confined spaces written program, and we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty of this. I'm happy to share the copy of this presentation so you can reference it. But these are the pieces that you need to consider in adding into a written program for the space. So not so much of you need to be in compliance, you need to be in compliance, you need to be in compliance, but there's some great pieces in this written program that really ensures that health and safety of yourself and your workers, that you have all these pieces that can be so very important in place. And so having that on paper and to be able to cross-reference will ensure your safety. To ensure that you have the right personal protective equipment, not just for, confined spaces, but in the farm in general, but, having those right pieces available should you have to enter a confined space. And of course, more into establish in writing, implement a system for the preparation, issue, and use and cancellation of entry permits. And so I'm going to get a little bit more into the permit, which goes along with this written program. So if you have the written program in place, then completing an entry permit will make it much easier, because the things that are required in the permit you should have already written out and in place through your written program. Point number 2 here, it says review established entry operations annually and revise the permit entry program as necessary. And then implement procedures that any attendant who is required to monitor multiple spaces will follow during an emergency in one or more of those spaces. Okay, so a permit required confined space. So your entry permit. And again, I really want to emphasize, no matter what size farm that you are, these pieces are essential for your safety. Whether, you're a production farm and you have multiple employees, or whether you have one, having this in place, I cannot stress, will help ensure that you have taken all the measures to keep everyone safe throughout this process. So in addition to, having your dates and your attendees, looking at the name and the signature of the supervisor. So this really states that people know what's going on, they have approved the entry, and that they realize that this is taking place. So all the folks that are involved in the situation are aware and are present if necessary. So just even having that with the entry permit, that having that signature really states, hey, I know this is going on. I'm going to be at the top of my awareness. Understanding the purpose of entry and known space hazards. So again, going back to having your written plan, doing your hazard analysis, and knowing what are the dangers if I enter this space. And so writing that out will really, again, bring that top of mind, and you have all your ducks in a row when an emergency does occur. Talk about or writing out the measures to be taken to isolate permit spaces and to eliminate or control space hazards. So are you wearing a respirator? Have you done your air testing? All those things all those measures that you have taken to eliminate those hazards. And again, on this permit, having your telephone numbers of your rescue services and the means to be used to contact them. So if you're in a rural area, knowing that you don't have cell phone service, that you need to use a landline. So it can be as specific as that. Having laid out your communication procedures and equipment to maintain contact during entry. So one of those essential points is never enter a confined space alone. And so having those communication procedures, because at some point, depending on where you are, that individual may be out of sight. And so having keywords and signals to know that the person monitoring and assisting can address any issues while the person is in that confined space. Realizing if you have to do anything beyond just actually entering, if you're going to have some hot work, knowing that there's additional procedures and hazard elimination that should take place. Write out special equipment and procedures, including your PPE and your alarm systems. Again, talking through what happens when an emergency occurs and the person is in a grain bin and things go awry. What are the procedures? Do you have an alarm system? Is there a signal word to alert those that need to assist in that particular emergency? And then, of course, any other information to ensure the employee safety. And again, I want to go back, whether it's an employee, it's your brother, it's your only work hand, it's your son, having these things in place really assists if things do go awry, that addressing them can happen more quickly. Okay, so there's two specific confined spaces that I'll be talking about today in our short time together. First is grain safety, and then as well as a manure pit. So some top safety tips to keep in mind when you're working in and around grain and grain bins. So number one, lockout, tag out, power supply on all unloading mechanisms. So always lock out the power source while someone is working on grain mechanisms or inside the grain bin. So this prevents anyone from unknowingly starting the equipment while someone is inside or in the structure. Lockout tagout is a serious signal that can prevent a significant injury. So if you're unfamiliar with lockout tagout, I encourage you to look into it a little bit more. It's especially important when you have multiple people in and around working on your farm. It certainly does prevent many hazardous accidents from occurring, not just in grain bin, but any piece of machinery or equipment that has a power source. So number two, do not enter grain bins alone or without an observer. So never work alone around a grain bin. Work in tandem with good communication. Someone should know what the activities are and should communicate if they leave the bin area. Remain in sight of each other and never lose sight of the other person. Number three, wear a safety harness and secure a lifeline. So having that right equipment if you do have to enter. And so when you're having the safety harness and a lifeline, it's quite difficult to use that on your own as well. So that ensures that you have another individual available. So number 4, wear a dust mask or a respirator. Not only with that dust mask or respirator, but you need to do that atmospheric testing to know that the atmosphere is appropriate and you do have the right personal protective equipment before you enter. So number 5, attempt to break up grain without entering the bins. So educate and train authorized family members or employees on the dangers of flowing grain. Ignorance can be deadly. An understanding of the speed of engulfment combined with the tremendous force of grain will develop respect for safety around flowing grain. And I'll have a video that demonstrates why this is so important. Number 6, take your time and use common sense. You think you can just pop in real fast and break up that clump of grain and get out because you just don't have time to call your brother to come over and assist you. Just slowing down and taking that moment to think through, is this a bad decision? You can prevent your own tragedy, and training your employees to think through that as well, that it can be a life-saving decision. And number 7, just with any piece of equipment, to avoid loose fitting or torn clothing while working around your equipment, whether it's your grain augers, your gravity wagons, anything that has moving parts. Just always make sure that you have appropriate clothing, that nothing can get caught in moving pieces. So going back to that flowing grain, one thing that I really want to point out is to manage and monitor stored grain for quality. So the number 1 reason entrapments occur is out of condition grain. Spoiled grain creates problems in unloading bins. A good stored bin management and monitoring program can prevent problems occurring in the first place. So management and monitoring is something that you control. So making sure that you have quality grain and that the conditions of the grain are right when you need to work with it. Okay, so I have a short video on grain safety. And let's hope our technology works.
It's a common practice this time of year. Farmers emptying grain from their bins. It's a routine operation, but University of Missouri Extension specialists urge farmers to be careful.
Flowing grain is a farmer's worst nightmare.
Frank Weidman is an MU Extension natural resources engineer. In a safety demonstration, Weidman shows the dangers of flowing grain.
The grain acts as a fluid. It will literally move out from underneath you, much like quicksand in a lot of situations.
Farmers sometimes go inside a bin to break up crusted grain. But once grain starts flowing, within seconds a person is trapped with no possible escape. The MU Extension safety expert says if you're trapped, quickly put your hands in front of your face.
What I've suggested to farmers is to protect their face and nose and mouth with their hands and actually provide a little bit of an air pocket.
MU Extension specialists say farmers need to slow down and keep safety in mind. Stay out of grain bins if at all possible. Keep children away. It's not a place to play. If you must go in, shut off power to the auger. Also, wear a safety harness attached to a properly secured rope. And always communicate with others.
If they have to get into the bin, be certain that they have someone to be with them so that they can monitor their safety and call for help if necessary.
Another tip, stay near the outer wall of the bin and get to the ladder or safety rope as quickly as possible. From the University of Missouri, I'm Kent Faddis reporting.
So as you can see from this short clip, just in the demonstration with the action figures, that how quickly that engulfment can occur. So making sure that you have all those safety tips in place to ensure your own safety and educating your workers on why they are so important as well. So next, we're going to talk about manure pit. This is an extremely short video, but just as a reminder that a manure pit is a confined space and it can be very, very hazardous. I feel more recently in the past few years, I've heard more about deaths in and around a manure pit, as many as I've heard with grain entrapment. So keep in mind that all these various spaces have unique hazards that you must pay attention to and evaluate and address with yourself and your employees.
I'm a manure pit, an integral part of your farm operation. I'm also a confined space. I can be found below ground and under livestock barns or above ground if I'm a tank or a lagoon. When you stand too close to the takeout valve, the gases I produce are just waiting to take you down. While you're pumping me out, I'm at my worst. I can fling gases your way that you might not even see coming. And if you're in the way without the proper personal protective equipment, too bad, because that's the last breath you may ever take. Hazards are everywhere. Be aware, get trained, and take action so you can be protected from hazards like me.
So like I said, it's a quick reminder about manure pits. So though you may not be entering a manure pit, God forbid you have to do that often, but being in and around it, all the gases that are produced by it can create a confined space type atmosphere. So considering this when working in and around, and ensuring that you have the right personal protective equipment available, and keeping a safe distance from pits as well. So a couple resources here. Again, I will provide a copy of this webinar to you so you have some of the key points that we discussed today. I really appreciate you taking time to join us during today's webinar. I'm talking about confined space safety. Again, this is a part of National Farm Health and Safety Week. Tomorrow we wrap up our series with health and safety for women. So the webinar will be at 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So again, thank you so much. I will be available online. If you have any questions, please use that chat feature. I will address them. Otherwise, thank you and have a safe day.